Hello, everyone. Welcome to Liam's Lyceum. I'm your host, Liam. This not actually having a background thing is really weird. I don't really know what's going on. StreamYard's updates, but it's fine by me. Um, Today, though, I wanted to talk about another one of the Percival romances that I'm reading. So, if you remember correctly, if you remember at all, and this is not like a quiz or anything, um, that I wanted to read three principal Percival romances. Um, for just for fun, pretty much, right? And that was starting with The Percival by Chrétien de Troyes, Story of the Grail, then Parzival by Wolfram von Eschenbach, and then uh, Perlesfaus by Anonymous. And I am in the middle of Perlesfaus right now, actually, but I'm not finished with it. And I wanted to supplement those main three with some smaller romances, being Paradour, potentially Parzival's Saga, um, probably after I read Perilous Faust, I'll go ahead and read the Quest of the Holy Grail, which introduces Galahad in the Grail quest, as opposed to just having Percival and kind of Gawain. Even in Perilous Faust, so already has Lancelot going into the quest as well. But today, I wanted to talk about Sir Percival of Gallus. This is normally put into an easy modern spelling, right? Sir Percival of Gallus, but that's not really how it's spelled. The title of the video is going to have how the Middle English would have it, and this is this is the only one so far I've read in the original. Um, I'm not sure if you can read this one online. Well, I think maybe you can get it like the Internet Archive or something. But I got this. It also has Owen and Gowan, and I will read that eventually because this is another romance I wanted to read. So I was very happy to get this and read both these romances. But since we're talking about Percival right now, I've only read Sir Percival of Gallus from this. It's pretty short, actually. It's only about 2,200 lines, almost 2,300 lines, which is short. Okay, that's about 1,000 lines less than Beowulf, for example, which is in of itself rather short as well. Um, and it is so it is Middle English, which would be the same time period as the other ones I'm reading, but it is later. It is not 12th century or 13th century. It's actually a 14th century poem, probably from the northeast of Midlands of England. It survives in one manuscript from 1440, compiled by Robert Thornton. His name is actually at the very end of the poem. Quote Robert Thornton explicit Sir Percival de Galles, Hera indus the romance of Sir Percival of Galles, cousin to King Arthur, which is incorrect. It's not actually cousin. So I don't know. Maybe Robert Thornton forgot what he was writing at the end there, but he's not the author. He's just the guy who took from an earlier manuscript that doesn't survive. Almost certainly there were some that actually went in a few places because Robert Thornton, this Lincoln Thornton manuscript would have been north of this Midlands where this was composed. So, and something had to go south actually, because it does show up. This a reference to this romance does show up in another medieval work, and I'll mention that in a second. But what's interesting about Sir Percival of Gallus is while it has a very similar opening sequence to Percival, not so much Parzival, which adds its own little like prequel thing going on, but once it gets to the where Percival starts by Chrétien, um, it pretty much follows a very similar sequence, and then gets into a few different things, of course, as Parzival's finished and Percival was not. So Sir Percival of Gallus, though, does not involve the Grail. There is no Grail. There's no Grail quest. There is no Fisher King. Okay. Pretty much what happens is you get to the Red Knight sequence and it changes. Now, you do have a little bit of a different happenings going on before that, um, but it goes in a different direction. And another thing that's also quite different about this one is that it's a parody. Okay. In some ways, you could read it as like, this guy is not a very good poet, and you could even say that anyways, even if it's a parody. But it very much is just meant to be funny, and it is funny. Okay, so the author really leans into Percival being a fool, which if you've read the Percival stuff, he is at the beginning of these romances. He's a fool, pretty much. Kind of fool has he's even called a fool in this one since it's in English. Fool has less intense meaning in Middle English. but he is still described as a fool. So one thing that's interesting though about Sir Percival Gallus, before we get into the story proper, is that it is actually referenced in Chaucer, in not just any Chaucer. It is a reference in the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer himself is a character in the Canterbury Tales, and he tells two stories. And one of them he gets interrupted in, and he doesn't finish. So he tells, the tale of Melody, but he also has the short, very different style tale of Sir Topas, which is literally topaz, and it's pretty bad in a lot of ways, but he's imitating it because he's using a sort of tale rhyme that in style he doesn't use anywhere else, right? And it's supposed to be itself itself is a satire of the romance genre, kind of like Sir Percival. What's funny is that Sir Topas is about a man who he's not interested in women unless he can marry like a fairy queen, which actually seems really similar to Marie de France's Guigamar. If you have Marie de France's Brown Lays. So if you want to read another medieval work there, she would be contemporary with Chrétien. So he's like, I'll tell you a story, and it's just very typical, like romance. All right, it does have some interesting stuff in it. Like there's this giant's name is Oliphant, if I'm remembering correctly. He's a child. He curses by Termagant, which is like this idol that Western Europeans believed that Muslims worshipped in the Middle Ages, right? And I think it actually first appears in the Song of Roland, but it's just nonsense, pretty much. But there's also another interesting part in here where he references a bunch of other romances. He says, "Men speaking of romances of prise, or excellence or praise, right? Of Horn, right? Of Hippotis, of Bevis, of Sir Guy, of Sir Lebeau." And then Plan d'Amour, which it says Plan d'Amour is like the only one we can't really identify here. Of all of them, actually, everyone we really read Horn. But at the very end of it, because it gets cut off, he says, "Himself drank water of the well, as did the knecht Sir Percyvelle, so worldly underwed, till una die." And then it cuts off because then the host is like, "No more of this for God's dignity." And so it's just he's making fun of it. It's funny that this is his story. This is Chaucer as the character, as his story, right? Chaucer himself also makes fun of himself in the little prologue to it. But I think it's funny that it ends with saying this Percival, as Sir Percival drank from a well, which really just means spring here. But let's go to the opening of Sir Percival of Gallus. And it says, "Lef litis to me 4 words or 3." So again, immediately irony, because he's saying, I'm going to take 2 or 3 words to tell you a story, but it obviously continues for thousands of more words. Of one that was far and free, so one that was fair and free, and fell in his ficht, so fiercer fell, like, he's fell in his fight, or his fighting. His rechte name, or nama, was Percyvelle, and he was fostered in the fell being moors in this case. And then he drank a water of the well. And it comes up actually near the end, and I think it's hilarious when it comes back up. But he drank water of the well, which just Chaucer making fun of Percival, and then that's where it ends. That's where it's like apparently terrible. You can't go any further than that. And yet that's the very beginning of Sir Percival Gallus. So the name itself, actually, in the story, so it has a different focus. And I want to say it is funny, but it's also not without its merits. Okay, and so it does have a little prologue. We have a knight named Percival, okay, and he marries Archefleur or something like that, which is King Arthur's sister. Her name is not normally spelled like this. It seems like it might have been a mistake based off wherever this author had his sources. Archefleur, that's her name, yeah. Here, and Sir Percival dies, and then Percival, the young Percival of the hero of the story, grows up in the manner that we know, right? He's not really told much about anything, really, right? And so what happens is when he sees the knights and he goes out and he gets a ring from his mom, right? And he's like, oh, okay, I'm gonna get a ring from a woman because that's what I was told to do. And so what does he do? He finds a sleeping woman and he exchanges rings with her. Okay, and then he goes on this quest, right? He fights the Red Knight. After he fights the Red Knight, he meets a woman, and this woman's like, "Oh, my son." It's the mother of the Red Knight. It's like, people have been saying you're dead, but I'm glad to see you're not dead. I'm a witch, but I couldn't raise you from the dead. And then when Percival's like, "Oh, she's a witch," he stabs her and then throws her in the fire, and it's just hilarious. And so it's pretty messed up in a lot of ways, but it's just funny. And so then he goes on. He fights a Black Knight. He does go to Maidenland. And a big chunk of the story I feel like is focused on this Sodana, which is a sultan. It's like a English corruption of the word sultan. His name is Golero Theram or something like that. I think is his name. And the note here at the back actually tells us that the term. Here, I'll just read it for you. That Mary Flowers Broswell tells us. I think it's 977. Yes. The Sultan is the chief ruler of a Muslim country, of course, but the term is seldom used with much precision. In medieval literature, such a character is pagan, powerful, and therefore evil, and is commonly foil to the hero. So he shows up for a while. Percival is super strong. He's killing everyone or defeating everyone, right? And he gets the attention of Louvamour, who is the maiden queen of this maidenland. And he ends up becoming a knight for King Arthur, and he marries Louvamour, and he becomes king of this land. This guy's still a fool, right? Because he rides a pregnant mare because he thinks it's a stallion, for example, right? So, though, I do want to go over some notes before I get to what the ending of the story is like. Let's see. Have any here? So yeah, right. So fool doesn't have a very strong connotation. So there is a part where a castle or hall appears suddenly, and this is a hint to expect some enchantment in medieval tales. This is where he receives his magical ring. And then the blood red clothing worn by this character seems to indicate that he, like the green clad figure in Sir Gawain the Green Knight, is an enchanter against whom everyone is powerless except the one whose destiny is to slay him. And then, so again, remember, we mentioned that the Holy Grail, the story of the cup, is not mentioned here. But although the story of the cup is elliptically treated here in 617, which we can go look at real quick. It says, the cup was filled full of wine. He drank of that was therein. All of red gold fine was the cup made. He took it up in his hand, that cup that he there found, and left them all sitand, and threw them he rode away. So there is a cup involved, but it doesn't really go anywhere else. So it says earlier critics suggested this is somehow linked to the health of Arthur's kingdom, which will decline without it, and in this respect, it is akin to a secularized Grail trope. In lines 1062, Arthur is said to have gone to Caerbed, and even though this is supposedly on account of his concern for the safety of Percival, it might earlier have been linked more directly to the stolen vessel, which could be, again, related to this Grail. And then it does have some similarities to David and Goliath stuff. Sertopus, again, is mentioned in these notes. It does say in line 682, it says, French and Hale note that in the Middle Ages, during the 12 days of the Christmas season, all fighting was forbidden. Casting one's foe into the marsh, however, seems to have been acceptable, as that is what happens. Anyways, and then we again have a reminder of Arthur's relationship with Percival as avuncular, which is like the most special of medieval relationships. And then I don't know if I looked. Yeah, I didn't really mark any of the other ones here. So it is a good book, though. I enjoyed it. So it is very short. What happens at the end is that he has his kingdom and stuff, and then he's like, you know what? I miss my mom. So if you remember in Parzival or in Percival, what happens is that he leaves his mom with no thought to her, and then she dies like immediately, and he gets reprimanded for it later. But nothing really happens there because his mom dies, right? There's very little as far as recompense. There is some familial stuff that Percival can do. In this case, though, the author has decided that he can literally just go to his mom. He can go back to his mom. She's not dead. Okay. And so he decides to resolve that issue of him just running off and leaving his mom. And he finds the lady he took the ring from. He discovers that the ring he took from her is magic, okay, and it means any wielder cannot die; they're invincible. And so he gives her ring back, but he finds out his ring has been taken by a giant. So he goes and slays the giant, cuts off its arms and hands and stuff like that. And then this giant, though, had terrorized his mother and driven her into the woods, right? And she's now drinking from springs. And so he leaves his armor. He goes to drink from springs himself, and he's wearing goat skin, just like he was when he was a lad. And he slays this giant. He restores his mother to her senses, takes her to his and his wife's castle, and that's pretty much where the story ends. And then it says that he went off to the Holy Land and conquered many cities and blah 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 and won many battles, and that's where he ended up dying. I think it has a very touching ending a lot. That he's just pretty much like, oh yeah, my mom, let's go back and get her. So it's very interesting, very different from the other Percival stuff, of a very different vein. And besides being written in Middle English, it is, like I said, a parody. It doesn't have the Grail. It's just funny at times, and in some ways less. It just seems less elevated, but I think it works pretty well. It's pretty short. It's pretty entertaining. So. And I'm glad to have read it. So we'll see how the other ones compare. That we'll get to this later. But again, thank you for me listening to me talk about Sir Percival of Gallus, some anonymous 14th century author from the East Midlands. So, anyways, leave from Lyceum. I will catch you next time.